When I realized he was watching us from the second-floor window, my pulse didn't spike from fear, at least, not the kind you're probably thinking of. It was the sort of dread that lives in the pit of your stomach when you're about to be unmasked. He wasn't supposed to be home that early. He wasn't supposed to stand there, behind the curtains, witnessing something I hadn't even fully admitted to myself yet. My fingers were still warm from the touch. My breath still carried the echo of a laugh that hadn't belonged to my husband in years. And in that split second, as our eyes met, mine, startled and pleading, his, unreadable, I felt everything freeze. I stepped back instinctively, creating distance I should have maintained all along, and turned to say something that would explain it all away. But there were no words. Nothing that could undo what he saw, or erase the story he'd already begun to write in his head. He didn't move. He just stared. The silence between us became a wall too high to climb. And that was the moment I knew everything was about to change. Maybe forever. But before I tell you how it all unraveled, how I got from being the woman with a perfectly organized kitchen and calendar, to the one whose reflection I barely recognized, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer me this. Have you ever crossed a line so quietly you didn't realize you were on the other side until it was far too late to turn back? The truth is, I didn't wake up planning to betray anyone. That morning was like most others, coffee slightly burnt, my husband barely glancing up from his laptop, the air between us filled with routine and silence. I sat across from him, watching the steam rise from my cup, wondering if he even noticed that I'd switched brands 3 weeks ago. He didn't. Or maybe he did, and just didn't care enough to mention it. At work, I was asked to train the new intern. He's the boss's son, they said with a half smile, half warning, like they weren't sure if that made him off limits or just extra work. When he walked in, he didn't look the part. He was younger than I expected, mid-20s, maybe. Clean-cut, but not polished. Like someone still trying on who he was supposed to become. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a slightly nervous grin. I didn't see danger in him. Just someone who needed help navigating a place I knew inside and out. I assigned him the kind of tasks meant to test both patience and intelligence, half expecting him to ask for shortcuts or try to charm his way out of real work. But he didn't. He worked hard. Asked thoughtful questions. Listened. The first time we stayed late together, it was purely practical. A deadline had shifted, and no one else was available. He didn't complain. In fact, he offered to fetch dinner, something I hadn't expected. When he returned, he handed me a sandwich and said, "You looked like someone who doesn't take breaks unless someone makes her." It caught me off guard. I didn't respond, but I didn't correct him either. That night, driving home, I thought about that small act of consideration. My husband hadn't brought me dinner in years. Not because he was cruel or inattentive. Just disengaged. Our lives had drifted into parallel lanes, never crossing, never clashing. Safe. Predictable. Exhausting. Over the next week, the intern and I fell into a rhythm. He became less hesitant, more confident. Sometimes he made me laugh, genuinely, not out of politeness. And sometimes I caught myself watching him too long, noticing things I shouldn't have, the curve of his jaw when he smiled, the way he leaned forward when I spoke, as if my words held gravity. I didn't tell anyone we were spending more time together. There was nothing to tell. But I did start wearing lipstick again. Nothing bold, just a subtle hint of color. A whisper of attention I hadn't given myself in years. My husband didn't notice. The intern did. "New shade?" he asked one afternoon, his tone light, unassuming. "Looks good." I brushed it off with a laugh, but the compliment lingered longer than it should have. One evening, as I packed up to leave, I noticed he was still at his desk. You should go, I said, half in jest. You'll make the rest of us look bad. He smiled, then said, more softly, I don't mind staying late if you're here too. There was a pause. Not long. Not dramatic. But heavy. I broke it with a practical excuse, something about traffic and early mornings, and left. In the car, I turned the radio up louder than usual, trying to drown out a feeling I didn't want to name. At home, my husband was watching a documentary. He didn't look up when I walked in. I stood there, keys in hand, waiting for something. But the silence between us swallowed the moment whole. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of wine, and sat alone. Later that night, lying next to a man who felt more like a roommate than a partner, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the intern's voice. His questions. His attention. I told myself it was harmless. Just a flicker. A distraction. Nothing real. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted. And that once certain doors open, they don't close again so easily. I thought that if I ignored it long enough, it would disappear. That maybe what happened on the parking lot, a moment so brief, so absurd, would dissolve under the weight of daily routine. I showed up to work the next morning 15 minutes early, dressed in a conservative gray blouse I hadn't worn in months. Hair pulled back. No lipstick. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I was trying to disappear into the version of myself I used to be. But when I entered the office, he was already there. Sitting at his desk, eyes scanning a report, brows slightly furrowed. He looked up as I passed by, and for a second, something flickered in his expression. Not guilt. Not confusion. Something steadier. Like he wasn't regretting what happened. Like he wasn't trying to forget. I avoided his gaze, mumbled a half-greeting, and locked myself in my office. The hours dragged. I buried myself in spreadsheets, tried to focus on clients, meetings, anything that didn't involve thinking about that kiss. But my mind betrayed me. It replayed the way his eyes softened, how his breath caught before he leaned in. The warmth of it. The danger of it. By lunch, I was unraveling. I told myself I needed air, that a walk might help. The city felt suffocating. The noise, the motion, the smell of concrete after rain. Everything too sharp, too vivid. I stood in the corner of a park for almost 10 minutes before I could even remember why I had walked there. When I returned, he was waiting by my door. "Can we talk?" he asked. His voice was low, almost cautious. I nodded. We stepped into the nearest conference room. I didn't sit. Neither did he. I shouldn't have done that, I said before he could speak. I know, he replied. Then, after a pause, but I don't regret it. That stunned me. Not the words, those I'd expected, but the steadiness behind them. He wasn't trying to manipulate me. He wasn't pleading. He was just being honest. I couldn't meet his eyes. It was a mistake. Maybe. But not meaningless. There was a silence after that, not cold, not heated. Just heavy. He left the room first. I stayed behind, staring at the table like it held the answers. That night at home, I set the dinner table like usual. My husband was late, again. I ate alone. I washed the dishes. I turned off the lights. When he finally walked in, he kissed me on the forehead and asked about my day. I lied. The next few days blurred. I kept my distance. So did he. We were polite in meetings, professional in tone. But every once in a while, I would catch him watching me. Not inappropriately, just attentively. Like he was listening, even when I wasn't speaking. It felt dangerous to be seen like that. On Friday, a project ran late, and most of the office had cleared out by 7. I stayed behind, reviewing files. I didn't know he was still there until he appeared in the doorway, holding a folder. "This goes in the client package," he said. "You almost missed it." I took it without looking at him. "Thanks." He didn't leave right away. "Are you okay?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to pretend like none of this mattered. But my voice betrayed me. "I don't know." He stepped back. "Then I'll go." He turned, but before he reached the door, I said, "You're not the problem." He stopped, but didn't look back. "Neither are you." And then he was gone. That weekend, I tried to lose myself in chores. I cleaned the fridge, washed the curtains, rearranged bookshelves. My husband noticed the effort but said nothing. At one point, he asked if I wanted to see a movie Sunday night. I said I was tired. He kissed my shoulder when I turned over in bed. I lay still. Not from anger. From emptiness. On Monday, I wore lipstick again. I didn't plan to. I just did. It wasn't for him. At least, that's what I told myself. When I walked into the office, he didn't say anything. But I saw the smile in his eyes. Not smug. Just soft. We didn't touch that day. Barely spoke, in fact. But there was an awareness now, a shared silence that lived between us, louder than any words. That night, as I sat in the car waiting at a red light, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror and asked myself a question I hadn't dared to before: what am I doing? And for the first time, I didn't have an answer. I tried to convince myself that time would soften everything, that if I just kept moving forward, the turbulence inside me would settle. But it didn't. If anything, the stillness on the outside only made the noise within me louder. Every day, I followed the same routine: early mornings, quiet breakfasts, silent commutes, measured smiles at the office. But underneath it all, I was a knot of contradiction. I was avoiding him, and yet I was hyper-aware of every place he stood, every hallway he walked down, every time his shadow passed behind the frosted glass near my office. When I got home, the evenings were somehow more unbearable. My husband and I sat on opposite ends of the couch like strangers trapped in a ritual neither one of us remembered how to leave. We talked, yes, about bills, groceries, weekend errands, but not once about anything real. We were polite, careful not to press too hard on anything that might bruise. Sometimes I wondered how long we'd been living this way. Months? Years? One night, I stood in the kitchen washing dishes and noticed my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. Her eyes were distant, her mouth drawn in that neutral line she wore for everyone's comfort. I turned off the water, wiped my hands on a towel, and walked to the bedroom without saying a word. My husband was already asleep, his back to me. The next day, I arrived at work earlier than usual. I wanted to clear my head before the team started trickling in. But he was already there. Sitting at his desk, headphones in, typing something on his laptop. He didn't notice me at first. I had the chance to walk away, to pretend I hadn't seen him. But instead, I stepped into the room. He looked up. "Morning," I said, my voice almost too quiet. He nodded. "Morning." I turned to leave, but he spoke again. "You don't have to avoid me." I froze for a second. Then turned slightly, just enough to meet his gaze. "I'm not." He gave a small, sad smile. "You are. And I get it. I just don't want you to think I regret anything." I didn't respond. I left before I could. But his words stayed with me all day. That afternoon, I had a meeting off-site. I took the car alone, trying to use the drive to clear my mind. But instead, I found myself replaying every moment with him, the kiss, the silence afterward, the look in his eyes that said he saw something in me I hadn't seen in years. On the way back, I stopped at a small cafe I used to frequent when I first started working in the city. I hadn't been there in over a decade. I sat at a corner table, ordered tea, and stared out the window, watching people hurry past, each of them wrapped in their own stories. I wondered what someone would think if they looked at me. A woman with a wedding ring and tired eyes, sipping tea like she wasn't trying to remember how it felt to be seen. When I returned to the office, most of the staff had left. The hallways were quiet, the overhead lights dimmed. I passed by his desk and noticed he was still there, headphones gone, staring blankly at his screen. He looked up as I passed, and I stopped. "Still working?" I asked, my voice too casual. He shrugged. "Trying to focus." I hesitated, then added, "The cafe on 7th, have you ever been?" He shook his head. "No." "Why?" I didn't answer right away. I just said, "You might like it. It's quiet. And real." Then I walked away before I could say anything else. The next morning, he brought me a coffee. From that same cafe. "I found it," he said simply, setting it on my desk. I didn't thank him. I couldn't. I just stared at the cup like it meant more than it should. Because it did. Later that day, I was in the copy room, sorting documents, when he walked in. We both stopped, the room suddenly too small. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "About everything. It's just complicated." He nodded. "I know. I'm not trying to make it harder." "I don't want to hurt anyone," I added. "You're not," he said. "But are you sure you're not hurting yourself?" That question followed me for the rest of the day. And the next. That weekend, my husband suggested we take a short trip, just the two of us. He said we hadn't done something like that in years. I agreed, though I didn't know why. Maybe out of guilt. Maybe out of hope. Maybe just to prove to myself that everything wasn't already lost. We drove up the coast, stayed in a small inn by the water. The scenery was beautiful. The food, decent. The silence between us, unchanged. We took walks, exchanged smiles, but we didn't talk about anything real. One evening, sitting on the balcony as the sun dipped below the horizon, I looked at him and tried to remember what it felt like to be in love. To be chosen. To be the center of someone's attention, rather than a fixture in the background. He reached for my hand, and I let him take it. But there was no spark. Only history. When we returned home, I unpacked slowly, placing everything back in drawers that no longer felt like mine. My husband kissed my cheek before heading to bed. I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the closed door. Then I went to the kitchen, pulled out the cup from that cafe, and poured myself a glass of water. I held it in my hands and let the silence of the house wrap around me. Everything looked the same. But nothing was. Monday came with a strange stillness. The kind that settles right before something inevitable happens. I woke up earlier than usual, not because of an alarm, but because my thoughts were already in motion before my eyes even opened. My husband was still asleep beside me, his breathing even and soft. I watched him for a moment, wondering when I had stopped knowing how to reach him. There was no hatred between us, no shouting, no betrayal in the conventional sense. Just years of carefully layered silence. At work, the atmosphere felt tense though no one said anything directly. A couple of my colleagues looked at me a little too long before returning to their keyboards. Maybe I was imagining it. Or maybe I wasn't. Either way, I kept my head down and pushed through the morning, answering emails, directing my team, pretending everything was under control. By late afternoon, the department head, his father, asked me to stay behind for a quick debrief. It wasn't unusual. We often stayed late together going over reports or preparing presentations. But that day, something in his tone felt sharper. More watchful. He closed the door behind us, which he rarely did. "I've heard things," he said, not looking up from his notes. I waited, not sure how to respond. "About you and the intern," he continued, finally meeting my eyes. "I don't want rumors in this office. I trust your judgment, but I also expect discretion." The words landed like a stone. Heavy, deliberate, just vague enough to give him an exit if I challenged him. But I didn't. I nodded once and said I understood. As I left the room, I saw the intern walking down the hallway. He looked up, saw my expression, and slowed. I shook my head slightly, a silent warning not to approach. He hesitated, then kept walking. Back in my office, I sat for a long time without doing anything. My hands rested on the keyboard, but the screen remained untouched. My thoughts were racing too fast to catch. After work, I avoided going home immediately. I stopped at a small bookstore, the kind with uneven wooden shelves and the scent of paper and time. I wandered aimlessly, touching spines, flipping pages I wouldn't remember. I bought a novel I'd already read twice, just for the comfort of knowing how it ended. At home, my husband was cooking. He rarely cooked. The smell of garlic and tomatoes filled the kitchen, warm and unexpected. He smiled when I walked in, almost shyly. "I thought I'd surprise you," he said. I nodded, unsure how to match his sudden effort. We sat down to eat, and for once, the silence between us wasn't sharp. It was simply quiet. After dinner, he poured us both a glass of wine. We talked about safe things, traffic, the neighbor's new dog, a promotion someone at his office received. I kept waiting for him to say more. To ask about us. But he didn't. And I didn't offer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, counting cracks, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath beside me. My phone buzzed once, just once, on the nightstand. I didn't check it, but I knew who it was. The next day, I left early and took a different route to work. I stopped at a bakery and bought 2 pastries. One for me, one for him. It wasn't planned. Just instinct. When I placed it on his desk, he looked up, surprised. "You didn't have to." "I know," I said, then walked away. At lunch, we ended up in the break room at the same time. Alone. The doors swung closed behind us with a soft thud. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Is this how it's going to be now?" "What do you mean?" I asked, avoiding his gaze. Careful gestures. Half smiles. Like we're dancing around something that already happened. I sighed. "We don't have a choice." He nodded slowly. "I know. But that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." The words sat between us like glass, as clear, delicate, easy to shatter. After work, he waited for me outside. I didn't expect that. "Can I drive you home?" he asked. I hesitated for a full beat, then nodded. The car ride was quiet. The city passed us in soft blurs of light and shadow. At a red light, he finally spoke. "I didn't mean to complicate your life." "You didn't," I said. "It was already complicated. You just reminded me of what I stopped letting myself feel." We pulled up to my building. I reached for the door, but paused. "Thank you," I said. "For the coffee. For seeing me." He didn't reply. Just looked at me like he wanted to say more but knew he shouldn't. That night, I lay awake again. My husband stirred in his sleep, his hand brushing mine for a moment before settling back. I didn't move. Something in me had shifted. Not a leap, but a quiet rearrangement. Like furniture in a room I thought I knew. And once again, everything looked the same. But I knew better now. Nothing was. The day started with the weight of anticipation. Not dread, not quite excitement either, just the heavy awareness that something had shifted and could not be put back the way it was. I moved through the morning with a kind of precision that came from muscle memory. Coffee. Shower. Blouse. Lipstick. Not the subtle pink I'd worn for years, but a shade deeper, richer, one I had stopped wearing because no one had noticed it anymore. Or maybe because I had stopped caring if they did. He wasn't at his desk when I arrived. For a moment, I felt a strange twist of disappointment, like I had stepped into a rhythm and the music had stopped without warning. I settled at my computer, opened my emails, and tried to shake it off. 30 minutes later, he appeared in the doorway of my office, holding a stack of papers, pretending that was the reason he'd come. "You left these in the conference room yesterday," he said. "Thanks," I replied, reaching out for them without looking up. But he didn't leave. He stood there, quiet, waiting. I looked up. Our eyes met. Something silent passed between us, and we both knew words weren't necessary. Later that afternoon, our team had a meeting that ran late. People trickled out one by one until it was just the two of us still in the room. No one seemed to notice. Or if they did, they didn't say anything. I stayed behind to organize my notes. He lingered. Then, softly, without fanfare or performance, he said, "I know I should have walked away sooner." I looked at him, expression unreadable. "You didn't make me do anything." "I know," he said. "But I wanted to." There was no bitterness in his voice, no pressure, just a statement of fact. I gathered my things and turned to leave, but he followed. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the pavement. We walked in silence for half a block, neither of us saying where we were going. When we reached the corner, he stopped. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I know," I replied. "But that doesn't mean I feel nothing." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked, "Would you come with me?" "Just to talk." I hesitated. "Just for a breath." Then nodded. We didn't go far. A small park nearby, mostly empty. We found a bench tucked behind some hedges, out of the way. He sat first. I joined him slowly. "I don't know what this is," I began, eyes on the path in front of us. "And I'm not sure I can give it a name." "I don't need you to," he answered. "I just want to be near you. Whatever that looks like." It was the kind of thing that might have sounded rehearsed if it had come from someone else. But with him, it felt real. Honest. The light was fading. The breeze picked up. I rubbed my hands together for warmth, and without a word, he shrugged off his jacket and draped it around my shoulders. I looked at him. He didn't say anything. Just waited. And then, we kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a statement. It wasn't even urgent. It was quiet, soft, and brief. A confirmation more than a question. When it ended, we didn't speak. We simply sat there, letting the silence stretch, letting the truth of what we had done settle between us. Eventually, he stood and offered his hand. I took it. He walked me back to my car, stopping a few feet away. "Take care," he said. "You too," I replied. I drove home with the windows cracked, the cool evening air rushing in, trying to clear my thoughts. But nothing could untangle the knot that had formed in my chest. At home, the lights were on. My husband was in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone while something simmered on the stove. He looked up when I entered, smiled as if nothing in the world had changed. "Hey," he said. "I thought we could eat together tonight." "Sure," I replied, placing my bag down with deliberate care. Dinner was quiet, but not uncomfortable. He asked about my day. I gave him edited highlights. He talked about a new client. I nodded in the right places. Afterward, we sat on the couch, a movie playing, neither of us really watching. At some point, he reached for my hand. I let him take it. And for a moment, I almost convinced myself I could still be this person. The woman he thought he knew. The woman I used to be. But inside, I knew better. Something had cracked open. And now that it had, nothing would ever be the same. The following morning was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The city outside moved through its usual rhythms, cars honking in the distance, footsteps on the pavement, the hum of weekday life, but inside our apartment, everything felt suspended. My husband was already gone when I woke, his side of the bed cold and smooth, untouched by restless sleep. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter, reminding me of a dinner with his colleagues scheduled for Friday, with a soft, "Hope your day goes well." No kiss. No name. Just a line, and his signature at the end, like a contract rather than a gesture of care. At work, I arrived early again. I wasn't sure why anymore. Maybe it had become a form of self-protection, starting the day before anyone else could make it complicated. But when I walked in, he was already there. At his desk. Headphones in. Back straight. Pretending to be lost in spreadsheets that probably hadn't changed since the day before. We exchanged no words that morning. Only glances. Just enough to acknowledge, never enough to suggest. Everything about us now was carefully measured, precisely navigated around the invisible boundary that had once been so recklessly crossed. The team gathered in the main meeting room around noon. A project deadline was closing in, and we had little time left to smooth over logistics. His father led the discussion with his usual sharpness, tossing out updates and criticisms with equal ease. At one point, I noticed his eyes flick to me, then to his son, then back again. It was subtle. But I caught it. When the meeting ended, I stayed behind to organize files while the others filtered out. He lingered. Not deliberately, I thought. Maybe unconsciously. We were standing too close again, both reaching for the same binder. My hand brushed his. Neither of us moved. "I've been trying not to make this worse for you," he said quietly, his voice low enough to stay between us. "You haven't," I replied, just as softly. "It's me. I'm the one who doesn't know how to keep things simple." He looked at me with a gentleness that undid me more than anything else ever could. "I don't think you were meant for simple." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat tightened with something between shame and clarity. That afternoon, I avoided him. I buried myself in reports, spreadsheets, any task that allowed me to pretend I still had control. But the truth was slipping, and I felt it everywhere, in the tremble of my hands, the tightness in my chest, the awareness that the divide between who I was and who I was becoming was getting harder to ignore. Later that evening, I stayed behind long after everyone else had gone. The office was silent. The hum of lights, the click of my pen, the sound of my own breath. I told myself I was waiting for traffic to thin out. But I knew I was stalling. Eventually, I packed up and headed to the elevator. Just as the doors opened, he stepped out. We both froze. "You're still here," he said, surprised. "So are you," I replied. We stood in silence for a beat. Then another. "I was thinking of grabbing something to eat," he said. Just somewhere quiet. I hesitated. Every part of me knew I should decline. Walk away. Preserve what little distance still existed. But I nodded. We ended up at a small diner a few blocks away. The kind with red vinyl booths and coffee that's been burning since morning. We didn't talk about work. Or the kiss. Or anything dangerous. We talked about films we'd never seen. Books we both pretended to read. The music our parents loved. And through all of it, I felt more myself than I had in years. Not the version I presented in meetings or over dinner with my husband's friends. Not the composed, competent woman who managed everything with grace. But the one who laughed without worrying how it sounded. Who said things without overthinking how they would land. As we left the diner, the air had cooled. The sky above was bruised with twilight. I should get home, I said. He nodded. Of course. He didn't walk me to my car. He didn't ask for anything. He just said goodnight, and that was enough. When I got home, the apartment was dark. My husband had sent a message, dinner with a client had run late. He'd be back after 11. I placed my keys on the counter and sat down on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, jacket still buttoned. The silence in the room was not peaceful. It was waiting. Watching. Asking questions I didn't have the courage to answer. I pulled out my phone. Opened our conversation thread. Stared at it. Then closed it again. I changed out of my work clothes, washed my face, and climbed into bed. Alone. Lying there, I thought about the things we didn't say at that diner. The words left hanging. The spaces that should have been filled. But weren't. And I wondered, if nothing ever happened again, would that make me a better person? Or just someone better at hiding what she felt? The answer didn't come. But the question refused to leave. The next morning began without ceremony, as if nothing in the world had shifted, though I knew better. The air in the apartment was still, too still, as if waiting for something to happen. My husband was in the shower when I left for work. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't wait. I simply gathered my things, closed the door behind me, and drove in silence, letting the motion of the road distract me from the weight I carried. The office felt quieter than usual, or perhaps it was just my perception again, heightened by nerves and memories. The days were blurring now, each one layering on top of the other, harder to separate, harder to interpret. Still, I moved through it, emails, reports, the low thrum of work that demanded attention even when my mind was elsewhere. He wasn't in when I arrived. That surprised me. I had grown used to seeing him early, always at his desk before most of the others. But his seat remained empty for over an hour. When he finally did appear, there was something different about his demeanor. He didn't avoid me, but he didn't seek me out either. He moved efficiently, spoke to others with clipped politeness, and stayed busy. Part of me felt relieved. The other part, the part that had grown used to the quiet connection, the glances, the gravity between us, felt strangely hollow. Around midday, the director's assistant reminded me of an off-site meeting I had forgotten, and I scrambled to pull together the necessary materials. At the last moment, I was told he would accompany me. Logistics, they said. Familiarity with the client. That was all. We left in near silence. The drive was long, just over an hour, and the roads wound through hills and suburban corridors. He offered to drive, and I didn't argue. I watched the trees blur past the window, letting the landscape fill the silence between us. About halfway through the trip, I finally spoke. You've been distant. He didn't look away from the road. I thought that's what you wanted. I don't know what I want, I admitted. But the silence is harder than I expected. He nodded slightly. It's hard to stand next to you and pretend I don't feel what I feel. The rest of the drive passed with that tension between us, thick but unspoken. When we arrived, the meeting pulled us apart. For 2 hours, we were professionals again, focused, aligned, efficient. I saw the way the clients responded to him, how he held his own, how much he had grown in such a short time. When we left, it was raining. We ran to the car, laughing through the downpour, soaked and breathless when we finally slammed the doors shut. For a moment, everything felt weightless, as if the storm outside had washed away everything else. We sat in the car, both of us dripping, laughing softly, the windows fogging around us. Then the laughter faded, and silence returned, heavier this time. He turned to me slowly. I could see the hesitation, the ache, the question in his eyes. "I know this can't last," he said. "I know it's complicated, and messy, and probably wrong." I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. "But that doesn't make it meaningless." I nodded, my throat tight. Then, as if the moment needed no more pretense, we spent the night together. We didn't plan it. We didn't even speak of it afterward. It happened with the same inevitability as falling asleep, slow at first, and then all at once. The next morning, I woke before he did. The room was dim, quiet except for the rain that hadn't stopped all night. I watched him for a long time, his face relaxed in sleep, so different from the version he showed the world. I rose quietly, dressed, and stood by the window. Outside, the world was beginning again, as it always did. Cars moved through puddles. Lights flickered on behind drawn curtains. Life continued, indifferent to what we had done. He stirred behind me but didn't speak. I didn't turn around. I didn't have the words. We checked out in silence. The drive back was quiet, each of us caught in our own thoughts. When we reached the city, he pulled up a block from my building. "I don't expect anything," he said finally. "But I needed you to know that this mattered." I looked at him, and for a moment, I wanted to say something, anything, that could make sense of it all. But nothing I could say would be enough. So I opened the door, stepped out into the gray morning, and walked the rest of the way home. When I entered the apartment, my husband was in the kitchen. He turned and smiled when he saw me, completely unaware. "Morning," he said. "You're up early." I managed a faint smile. "Yeah. Long drive." He nodded, returning to his coffee. I stood there for a long moment, watching him move through his routine. And all I could think was how strange it felt, to be standing in the same place I had always stood, yet no longer belonging there in quite the same way. Everything was still in its place. The chairs, the mugs, the quiet between us. But nothing was the same. The days that followed unfolded in strange silence, as though the world around me sensed something had cracked beneath the surface and was giving me room to figure out what to do with the pieces. I went through the motions of daily life with practiced ease, but everything felt slightly out of place, too quiet, too measured, too controlled to be real. My husband continued his routine without noticing much change, or perhaps he noticed but chose not to say anything. At the office, I saw him, of course I did, but we barely spoke. There was an unspoken agreement, a pause in whatever had been forming between us. He no longer waited for me by the elevator. He no longer brought coffee or lingered near my door. We worked as if nothing had happened. As if we had imagined it all. And yet, the silence was filled with tension. Every glance we exchanged was heavy. Every time we passed in the hallway, I could feel the electricity in the space between us, the questions we weren't ready to ask. Then, on a Thursday morning, I came into the kitchen to find my husband already dressed, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I entered, studying me a little longer than usual. "I made dinner reservations for tomorrow night," he said. "Just the two of us." I blinked, surprised. What's the occasion? Do I need one? He asked with a slight smile, but there was something else beneath his tone. Something more calculated. I nodded slowly, offered a polite sounds good, and turned away to pour my coffee. The next day, the air in the office felt heavier than usual. I kept my head down, focused on the endless list of tasks, trying to stay grounded in what I could control. But in the late afternoon, the director called me into his office. He closed the door behind me. Sat down. Folded his hands. There's been talk, he began, his voice calm but deliberate. Not just around the office. Elsewhere. I said nothing. He studied me for a long moment. I don't want this to affect your position here. You've done excellent work. But I need to know it won't become a distraction for you or for him. I nodded. It won't. That's good, he replied, still watching me closely. Because this kind of thing can escalate. And I wouldn't want to see it cost you something you've worked so hard for. I left the office with my heart pounding in my chest, not out of guilt, but out of the crushing awareness that people had started to see what I had fought so hard to keep hidden. Later that evening, I dressed for dinner. I stood in front of the mirror longer than necessary, adjusting my earrings, touching my hair, applying my makeup with precision. Not to impress. Not to seduce. Just to feel like someone in control. My husband picked a quiet restaurant with low lighting and white tablecloths. He ordered a bottle of wine without asking. We spoke about surface things, work, weather, and news story he found absurd. Then, halfway through the meal, he set his glass down and looked at me differently. I've been thinking, he said. About us. About the way we've changed. I paused. What do you mean? We don't talk like we used to, he said. We don't laugh like we used to. I know we've both been busy, but I can't help but wonder if we've stopped being close. The words weren't accusatory. They were tentative, searching. I think we've just fallen into a rhythm, I replied, keeping my voice level. Life gets in the way. He studied me for a moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. I haven't been perfect either. There was a pause. I saw someone for a while. A few months ago, he added. It wasn't serious. It didn't last. But it happened. I stared at him, heart slowing instead of racing. My first thought wasn't betrayal. It was relief. Not because I wanted him to hurt, but because I suddenly understood we had both drifted in our own ways. I see, I said finally. He looked uncomfortable. I just wanted to be honest. I didn't want to carry it around anymore. I nodded. Thank you for telling me. We sat in silence for a long time. Not angry. Not even sad. Just quiet. On the drive home, he reached for my hand at one point. I let him hold it. His fingers felt familiar, like they always had. But something in me had changed too much to pretend we were the same people who had once fallen asleep tangled in each other without walls between us. That night, I lay awake long after he had drifted off beside me. My thoughts were a steady hum of memories, doubts, and the faint echo of a voice I hadn't heard all day. I reached for my phone. Opened the thread. Typed. I need to see you. But I didn't send it. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. Then I deleted the words, one by one. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and turned onto my side, away from the man who had once known every corner of my heart. In the dark, I closed my eyes and told myself that not all endings are dramatic. Some arrive quietly. Like a tide that pulls away so slowly, you don't notice the shore has changed until you try to walk back. And realize you no longer know the way. The air inside the office had taken on a new kind of density. The usual rhythm of meetings, emails, coffee breaks continued around me, but I no longer moved through them with the same focus. I performed my duties. I said all the right things. But behind my practiced expressions and professional tone, something in me had begun to float, detached, directionless, weightless in a way that was not freeing but quietly alarming. I caught glimpses of him throughout the day. Always from across the room, always when I least expected it. Sometimes our eyes met, sometimes not. He didn't approach me, and I didn't approach him. There was nothing to say that wouldn't undo the fragile balance we were trying so hard to maintain. But silence, I had come to learn, was never truly empty. It was filled with everything unsaid, everything restrained, everything waiting. And it wore on me. That afternoon, while walking to the printer, I passed by two colleagues speaking in low voices. They stopped abruptly when they saw me, offering polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. I didn't slow down, didn't ask what they had been discussing. I didn't need to. Later, a message appeared in my inbox, brief and signed. A single sentence. People are talking. I stared at it for a long moment before deleting it. I closed my laptop and stepped out of the office. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just walked. Down the street, past the bakery with the crooked sign, past the coffee shop where we had once sat across from each other, trying to pretend we were just two professionals sharing a moment of calm between meetings. I kept walking until my legs ached and the noise of the city dulled to a low, indistinct hum. Eventually, I found a bench in a small, shaded corner of a park. I sat down and breathed. The last time I had been there, I had been someone else. Someone unsure, but still untouched by the consequences. Now I was living with them. Every day. When I returned to the office hours later, the sun was beginning to set. My inbox was full, my voicemail blinking. I ignored both. At my desk was a note. Folded. Handwritten. No name. Tonight. Same place. If you want to talk. It didn't need a signature. I left without answering. That evening, I stood in front of my closet for too long. The same familiar pieces stared back at me, work dresses, cardigans, neatly folded scarves. Nothing seemed right. I didn't want to look too formal. Or too casual. Or like I was dressing for him. Eventually, I chose something neutral. Safe. The cafe was mostly empty when I arrived. He was already there, sitting by the window, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea. He looked up when I walked in, but didn't smile. I sat across from him without speaking. For a moment, neither of us said anything. We just watched each other in the low light, two people caught in something neither had fully planned, neither could fully end. Finally, he broke the silence. I heard the rumors are spreading faster. I nodded. I never wanted to make this harder for you. You didn't, I said quietly. We both made choices. He looked down at his hands. I thought I was strong enough to just admire you from a distance. That it would pass. But it didn't. No. It didn't. There was a pause. I told my husband, I said, surprising even myself. About someone else. I didn't say who. But I said it happened. He looked at me, startled. What did he say? That he had done the same. Months ago. It wasn't serious, he said. Just something that happened. Does that make it easier? I thought for a moment. No. Just clearer. We're not the people we used to be. Or maybe we never were. He nodded slowly. Do you regret it? He asked. I looked out the window. The city lights were starting to blink to life, one by one, like stars coming out too early. "No," I said. "But I don't know what to do with it now. I don't want you to lose your job. Or your name. Or your peace. I've already lost the version of myself that cared about appearances more than truth." We sat there until our drinks went cold. When I stood to leave, he didn't follow. He just said, "Take care of yourself." I nodded. "You too." Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. I walked the long way home, taking streets I hadn't used in years, as if retracing steps that never quite led anywhere solid. At home, my husband was reading in bed. He looked up when I walked in. "You're late." I needed some air. He didn't press. That night, I lay awake again, watching the shadows shift on the ceiling. I no longer expected sleep to come easily. I had made peace with the fact that some nights would be spent reckoning with myself. Before I turned off the light, I pulled out a small notepad from my drawer and wrote a single line. I chose this. I didn't know if I meant the kiss. Or the silence. Or the story I had let unfold because I was too tired to fight the version of me that had longed to feel something again. But it was true. And sometimes, truth was the heaviest thing to carry. The morning after I wrote those words, I woke with a stillness I hadn't felt in months. Not peace's peace was too distant, too clean, but a kind of clarity. Something had ended, even if it wasn't visible from the outside. I moved through the house slowly, noticing the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the dull clink of the spoon against my coffee mug, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. Every sound felt amplified, as if the world was reminding me that I was still here, still present, even if the person I had been no longer was. My husband had already left by the time I came into the kitchen. His absence didn't hurt, it didn't even register as unusual. We had become so skilled at coexisting without intersecting that the silence between us felt less like a void and more like familiar furniture, easy to ignore, easy to walk around. I dressed without care for color or coordination, pulled my hair back into something that resembled intention, and left the apartment with no specific plan. I didn't go to the office. I didn't check my calendar. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the city, past the buildings where so much of this had begun, past the corners where I had waited, watched, wondered. At one point, I stopped at a traffic light and saw him on the opposite side of the street. He was walking alone, no coat despite the chill, his posture a little more inward than usual. For a brief second, he looked up and saw me. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us waved. The light turned green, and I drove on. I didn't know where he was going. I didn't want to follow. But something in that glance settled something inside me. The acknowledgement. The restraint. The silent agreement that we had taken things as far as they could go, and maybe further. That afternoon, I went to the gallery I used to love when I was younger, before career and marriage had consumed every spare minute. I wandered the rooms without direction, letting the colors and lines wash over me. One canvas in particular caught my eye, a wide abstract piece, dark blues layered beneath soft creams, jagged reds slicing through like fault lines. It reminded me of something I couldn't name, maybe myself, maybe us, maybe the quiet violence of change. In the gift shop, I bought a postcard print of the piece. On the back, I wrote a single sentence. I won't forget what it meant. I never sent it. I folded it, tucked it into the back pocket of my journal, and left it there like a pressed leaf. Something preserved, not to be shared, not to be relived. Just acknowledged. At home, the apartment was still. The light from the windows stretched across the floor like it always did. But now I saw it differently. Not as a reminder of what was missing, but as proof of what remained. The space, the air, the time. I opened the closet and pulled out the boxes I hadn't touched in years. Old notebooks, photos, clothing that no longer fit the body or the life I inhabited. I sorted quietly, methodically, discarding what no longer served me. It wasn't an act of anger or finality. Just acceptance. In one box, I found a small envelope with my name in my own handwriting. Inside was a note I had written to myself the year I turned 35. I had forgotten it completely. The words were simple. Don't forget who you are when no one's looking. I sat on the floor for a long time, holding that note. Then I stood, folded it, and placed it back where I had found it. Not to hide it again, but to honor that version of myself, the one who had dared to ask for more. That night, my husband came home late. He looked tired. He poured himself a drink, sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and said nothing for several minutes. Then he finally looked up. Do you want to keep doing this? The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't even heavy. It was just real. I thought about it before answering. I don't know, I said. But I think we stopped doing it a long time ago. He nodded. We didn't argue. We didn't dissect. We simply sat there, two people slowly removing the masks of what they thought marriage was supposed to look like. I went to bed before him. I lay down on my side of the bed and stared out the window, watching the city blink in the distance. There was no dramatic conclusion. No grand gesture. Just the slow, quiet dismantling of a life built on unspoken compromises. And in its place, the beginning of something else. Not joy. Not freedom. Not yet. But truth. And sometimes, truth is the closest thing to redemption we're allowed.